have a lot of ways to kind of think about this, but I'm going to start with 2 years ago. I was sitting right out here because I'd come to some decisions that seemed that this would be an appropriate venue. So can I send the architects home with at least one little bit of brain understanding? Neuroscientists already know this. Take your fingers like this. Okay, this is your brain stem. Okay, this is your reptile part of your body, and if part of this goes down, you're dead. On top of this, on top of this is the limbic area, and this is your mammalian brain, and this is your emotional centers. If you do this, this is about the size of your brain, and it's the thinking cap that goes on top of this. This is what makes you primate and human. I've learned that from 2 years ago, and I thought I'd share that, so when the architects go home, they go, what'd you learn about neuroscience? You kind of do the hand thing, which is... I thought about calling it the party, but I don't know if that's absolutely correct. Before I get started, I'm going to say we a lot, and it's Michael Luczak is right here, one of my graduate students. If you want to talk about neuroscience with people in architecture, there's not too many. And so I needed Michael to work through some of these things, and after the first Congress, I was excited. I went to the people who teach us at K-State how to give out grants or how to win that stuff. And I said, I've been to how do I get this? How do I get money to do this research? But what do architects have to offer science? A couple days later, I'm back. Well, what architects have to offer science is application, from roofing to statistics or statics to neuroscience. This is the thesis we want to share today. In architecture, embodiment allows us to have an aesthetic experience when encountering an atmosphere where the physiological result is mood. Now, we've known as architects, at least for the last 3,000 years or so, from the Greeks through Vitruvius, that we measure architecture with our entire body. When I speak to my friends in architecture, they go, yeah, who doesn't know that? It's not necessarily an intuition, but it's a deep knowing from the practice of architecture. 100 years ago, there was a theoretical proposition where that understanding and that projection was called empathy or psychology. About 20 years ago, with the discovery of mirror mechanism and mirror neurons, empathy now becomes embodied simulation. I'm going to try to get this across because I think this is the thing that changes everything for architecture. Years and years ago, when I was a young architect in San Diego, for instance, teaching at a place called New School, and we were in Chula Vista, just one stop short of the border, I found this book, which was a story about the act of creation by Arthur Koestler. And the lessons that he gave me were what I was looking for, which is that, what is it about art that the architect could absorb in order to do what other artists do, which is to make involuntary response in an observer. Now, Koestler's is a broad spectrum journalist review of the science of his day, but I still think it's pretty good. And his proposal is that there's 3 personalities to the creative act. Moving from left to right, the jester, which is about humor, which is actually the easiest to perform. But the involuntary response is laughter. He puts the sage in the middle, think scientist, where the involuntary response is revelation. On the right is the artist, think Hamlet, think drama, where the involuntary relationship is weeping. Humor is the easiest way to demonstrate this sense of aesthetics, so here we go. As a peripheral visionary, I could see the future, but only way off to the side. This is a joke from Stephen Wright, but the premise is this. The comedian has to get you on board and get you moving with him. And so he says something like, I'm a peripheral visionary. I can see the future. And since emotions are quick to attach to this, he's got you on board and he's moving you down the line. He breaks that with a nimble intellect and says, look, folks, you can only do that but way off to the side. And you're intellect, which is more nimble than the inertia of emotions, fractures this, and you end up with laughter, or so he says, you break the tension with laughter. And it's this teamwork, or mechanism of thinking and feeling, which is the basis of an applied approach or an applied practice of aesthetics experience. So these are the two fundamental lessons. Number one, that creation means recreation. So to create something means that there has to be something happen out there. And it's the recreation that is the aesthetic experience, right? That one recreates. You get the joke, right? Call it beholding or however else we might put that. But as an architect, you're trying to elicit some response from the audience. And this happens when somebody re-envisions it, quite literally. And whether it's like getting the joke, which is some architecture, getting a theory, which is like some architecture, or getting a dramatic character, which is like some architecture. In fact, I should point out while I'm thinking about it, on that chart, moving from sage, scientist, to artist, in between that is probably where the architect lies, and that's called a benevolent magician. The second thing to think about in terms of the application of aesthetic experience, well, it's really been taken over, as John was suggesting, by a guy named Zeki. And I like two things from Zeki. One, he says that it's not that I ran out of real science to do, but he says the natural trajectory of what I'm looking at is aesthetics. And that his aim, and he's writing in Inner Visions, was that really from this point on, from the discovery of mirror neurons on, no real theory of aesthetic experience can be valid or substantive without looking at the looking at the brain, let's put it that way. All right, so aesthetic is a broad debate. We're not going to get into philosophy, all this pretty good fun. But as architects, aesthetic experience is deeply rooted in the classical. An understanding that was initiated by Vitruvius, at least, in the origin of our profession. But Gallese and Caesar, they did a review of all the neuroscience that was out, I think it was 2009, and proposed a definition that's well in line with what we're looking at, which is this. An aesthetic experience is one that allows the beholder to perceive, feel, sense, and artwork, insinuating that's all happening pretty much at the same instant, which in turn implies an activation of sensomotor, emotional, and cognitive mechanisms. Now for us, Vittorio Gallese seems to have the most to say about aesthetics. And again, I was surprised as I began to review the literature on neuroscience and the brain, that Gallese, again, when the natural extension of his work is into aesthetic experience. And I'm thinking, this is pretty good, because this is what architects do. We're on the same page now. In Motion, Emotion, and Empathy in Aesthetic Experience, which was written with Columbia art historian David Freedberg, they convincingly challenge 50 years of art history. That the primary mode of art, to that point, is understood as cognition. They say, not so much. That the basic level of understanding is actually biological, seated in the brain. It's not cognition, which isn't to disregard those things which are cognition, but to recognize instead that some of what was given to cognition is actually simply brain function that we all share. They further point out, which is important to architects, that this simulation occurs not only in response to figurative objects and works, but also in response to experience of architectural forms, such as the twisted Romanesque column. Look, I have to tell you about embodied simulation. He gets it. The thing about embodied simulation is if we take it to its natural conclusion, embodied simulation infers that everything we understand through our brain is embodied. Now, the cliff notes, is that going to be okay? You guys can hear me with that going on? That embodied simulation resides by the projection that we have, that everything we have and understand in the world around us is actually a projection of ourselves through our motor system, through our motor mechanisms. And again, I think this is an absolute confirmation of what architects have always known. In other words, we understand the world through our own motor mechanisms. And this again takes us back, if we follow this, to the point person that Johanni suggests the other day, that it's really a Merleau-Ponty phenomenology. That if we follow the brain science and we follow the architecture, we're going to end up in a Merleau-Ponty phenomenology. This is Andre Pisano from the Opera del Duomo in Florence. And this is an amazing piece. And I like to get my students and we walk up to the statue and she looks at you across 700 years and she'll light you up. Now some of this has to do with what is architecture and what is mere building. And we're talking about architecture's aesthetic effect, which is not to say that all buildings don't give you an effect, but it's not all aesthetic. And it's not architects who have the ability to bound the category of architecture. This is a dolmen, Panumba, which is in Dolmen, County Clare in Ireland, somewhere between circa 4200, 2700 BC. It's architecture from our Neolithic forebears. It's known as the soul of sorrows. And it sits on the burn today, much as it always has. And I know the question you're asking, right? How'd they get that big stone up there? And that hasn't changed in a long time. How did they get that stone up there? Now, we're familiar with this for those of you who are not architects, the half a dozen or so. This is a Pilgrim's Chapel on Ronchamp. But it's not intentional, this relationship that I might find between these two, but it's not accidental either. Both of these objects collect the horizon in a very serious way and then lift the roof off. And so our embodied response to both of these is quite similar. It might be, and I'm suspicious of this, that the standing stone is the origin of our profession as architecture. The origin of the aesthetic projection, and it might even be the origin of natural sciences, the way it fixes a point, collects the horizons, and does so many things to observe the nature around us. And in terms of embodiments, an interesting story from Irish mythology, which is that the glaciers moved these stones around. And when the Neolithics found them, the speculations, they said, well, what are you doing there, friend? We should take you to some place where you belong. Let us set you up in a proper location. These are the stones at Cavendish, and certainly seem an absolute embodiment of what Johanni calls the seven senses. Mine is number 50, but mine has a seabird out towards the end. The most concise framing of the profession of architecture that I can share with you was given by Louis Kahn, and he says, a great building, in my opinion, must begin in the unmeasurable, must go through measurable means when it's being designed, and in the end, again, be immeasurable. And this notion of atmosphere is what is measurable. But what I might suggest at the end here is that maybe there's a portion of that we actually can measure. Like Arbiv said, we should use Peter Zumthor, so I'm going to use Peter Zumthor once more. He's made a wonderful little book that has a title of Atmospheres, so it's pretty handy. But he is a pretty good architect, and he seems quite interested in this category of, how is it that we make this thing which we can't touch, but frankly is quite palpable. We'll skip that. Here's another important aspect. If Zumthor is right, I enter a building, I see a room in a fraction of a second, and this room actually is by probably the first modern practice architect, a guy named Brunelleschi, and this is Santo Espirito in Florence. If what he says is true, and I think it is, that our reaction to an architectural atmosphere is that fast. So really the problem for the architect is once the first impression is done, how does one sustain first impression after first impression after first impression after first impression? And if you put it on the level of pleasure, which is one of the parts of the brain that kicks in, it could be like a love affair, and it will go that way. And we won't talk about buildings then that are not architecture. When I studied my friend Kosla's actor creation, I came to the conclusion that the medium of architectural experience, the exchange that the architect has with his audience is mood. And I didn't like that very much because it didn't sound like a very good term. It seemed like it should be something more substantial, something greater. Until you realize that mood is actually a psychological condition and it should be able to be measured. So mood is to climate what emotion is to weather. Mood is the slow unfolding of emotions, not the fast unfolding. And certainly, we can come to the Kimball Art Museum. Now, most of the architects know that he was asked to do a domestic scale building. He took a drawing through that section. He stole a competition entry image from Alvar Aalto, and he made a faceted ceiling, he said, on the side, a silver light from above. So small-scale domestic, and yet at the end of the project he comes where you can see silver light from above. And this is a long run to have that conception, that imagination, and hold this thing together until the building is built. So here we go. In Reprise, in architecture one has an aesthetic experience when encountering an atmosphere through sensory embodiment, which allows us to have aesthetic experience, where the physiological result is mood. Atmosphere, the immediate measure of an environment that affords our sensory participation. Aesthetic experience manifests when embodied simulation synchronizes with our imagination. Mood, our state of mind, thoughts and feelings which stimulate the way we perceive the space. Architects create atmosphere, the state of the place, in full sensory intention. The observer recreates the architecture as an emotive sensory experience. And Michael, here we go. What we would really like to do is that small piece of the aesthetic experience, which can be measured, we would like our scientists, colleagues to see if we could learn how to do that. I'll say we tried, but we can't do it. Thank you, that's it.